Now let's talk about how to mitigate the scanning that an attacker can do on us. Now, we actually can't eliminate this, obviously, but we can mitigate and reduce the amount of information that is sent out there that the attacker can use. Now, this actually requires some careful attention on the part of the system administrators and network administrators and even users, and it requires you to configure the network very securely. Basically, what this involves is hardening the TCP/IP stack at the host level, the network device level, and security devices. That means firewalls and IDSs. It also means that you should use intrusion detection systems that are properly configured to catch this traffic as it's being sent by an attacker and to take action. And that could either be to reject or drop the packets or to even block certain kinds of traffic that's out there. Now, blocking these ports and protocols, as well as changing the way different hosts respond to these scans, this will all help you prevent the attacker from getting too much information about your network. Some things that we can do, just in general, to mitigate scans: use network traffic filtering. Obviously, filter things at the router level, the firewall level, and even the IDS level. And what are we going to filter on? Well, we can filter based upon source and destination IP addresses. In other words, we can drop traffic headed to a particular IP on our network, and we can drop traffic that comes from a particular source IP address. Along the same lines, we can also filter by DNS domain. In other words, if we see something coming from a domain called evilhacker.com, just for example, we could drop everything coming from that and not allow it into the network. We can also filter by ports and protocols. We don't have to allow every single port and protocol to come in the network. We can filter those and block all of them except a few of them, only the ones that are necessary to come in. We could also filter by time of day on some devices. Perhaps we will allow certain traffic to come in during certain parts of the day, but not during others. In any case, what we want to do is use a secure configuration for all of our network and security devices. And this also includes any host that faces the internet. This would be like a web server, for example. So you would want to lock down all of these hosts and devices in a secure fashion. So what are the things we need to look at and block and protect? Well, we want to block ICMP and UDP protocols into the network. In other words, if they're coming into our network from another network, we want to block them. We don't necessarily need those to come into our network. We also want to block internal IP addresses from coming into our network. Now, why would you think we might want to do that? Well, it's to avoid spoofing attacks. If our own IP addresses that reside inside our network are coming from the outside, that means someone's trying to spoof our network IP addresses. So we might want to block those from coming through the firewall into the network because they have no business being outside the firewall in the first place. If you have something like VPN traffic or remote access traffic, that actually should be on a different subnet so you can identify it a little bit easier. Another thing we need to look at is changing system and application banners. In other words, making it so that when a box gives up a little bit of information, it doesn't give up too much. You can change banners to say nothing or to say false information when it gives an error message, for example, or when it responds back to a query. Another thing you can do is use both network-based and host-based firewalls. Obviously, the big firewall on the outside of the network is what's going to keep the majority of the traffic out. But keep in mind that some traffic will still come into the network, and it needs to. But you can also use a host-based firewall to prevent the host itself from being compromised, to prevent certain traffic from getting to it if it doesn't need to. You also may want to filter your traffic using border routers. The firewall doesn't have to do all of the heavy lifting. You can filter certain traffic coming into the router before it even gets to the firewall. If you know that you never need port 25 coming inbound, for example, then block it at the border router before it hits the firewall. Or if you know you never need a certain other protocol or port, then block that. One thing that you need to do in your network design is set up a DMZ architecture such that you have an external router and firewall, and then any internet-facing servers that give services to the internet, and then another router and or firewall that blocks traffic coming to the inside of the network. So you have those internet hosts between those two firewalls. This will help prevent anything from getting into the internal network that doesn't need to. Obviously, you would want to close all of your ports that you don't need. If you don't need port 80 on a box, close it. Uninstall any necessary services. This could mean SMTP, SNMP, and so forth. You also want to protect any internet-facing services and servers. Again, put these in the DMZ if you need to. And finally, I would tell you to configure your IDS to block or reject any traffic meeting certain conditions, like if you see network scanning that's coming in at an alarming speed or at a certain frequency or using certain source addresses or using certain types of protocols. You could configure your IDS to block this traffic, and that would help mitigate any scans or other attacks that might come into the network.